So the Washington Wizards, after a weird offseason where they turned Bradley Beal into a ton of pick swaps and eventually Jordan Poole, have essentially allowed the bottom to fall out from under them. They are committing to a full-scale rebuild with a pretty young roster with little to no continuity. I expect them to be one of, if not the worst team in the NBA, and today I'm going to discuss why, if I had to put my money on it, they will be the worst team in the NBA. This is going to be the beginning of a scripted power ranking series where I just rank all 30 teams in the NBA just before the season starts. And we're going to start at the very bottom with the Washington Wizards. So let's get into it. So let's start by looking at the depth chart at this team. So with the wing spots, Deni Avdija, Bilal Coulibaly, and Corey Kispert are some of the headliners. All three are extremely young, especially Coulibaly, who was one of the biggest projects in this year's draft, though he has some defensive upside, which we'll talk about later. And with that youth and lack of continuity between these players, other than Kispert and Avdija, who have played together a little bit, I imagine it'll be very hard for them to sort of play off each other, and they'll only really be able to provide tertiary elements to an otherwise pretty awful team. Headlining this wing group, though, is Kyle Kuzma, who isn't much of a playmaker himself and is just an average three-point shooter. He shoots above league average volume for sure, about 7.5 threes a game, but he shoots them at like 33%, so how great of a shooter is he really? And then other than that group, Danilo Gallinari and Patrick Baldwin are not going to be sustaining any elite wing rotations whatsoever. And so I imagine that this Wizards ring rotation is going to be nothing short of blah. There's just a whole lot of blah throughout this roster, which is kind of a common theme with the Washington Wizards every year. But finally, it looks like this blah is just a little bit worse than the last few years. If we go to their guard depth, Johnny Davis, after having a pretty not great rookie season, he actually turned it around a little bit towards the end, but for the most part, he essentially didn't play at all. He's going to probably be coming off the bench next to Tyus Jones and DeLon Wright, and they'll basically be trading minutes at the guard positions, along with Jordan Poole, who is also going to jack up a ton of shots next to Kyle Kuzma. That duo is hilarious. There's going to be no playmaking whatsoever. There's not going to be a lot of efficiency coming from Poole. And I imagine that this is going to be a very fun year for him. He's going to love it in Washington, but they are going to stink because of it. Now, Tyus Jones off the bench. If we actually start talking about their offense, Tyus Jones is probably the best initiator on this team. He's a good playmaker who turns the ball over at such a low rate that he's one of the best assist to turnover ratio guys of all time. Though without any playmaking next to him, without a ton of shot creating or shot making next to him, especially at the center position where they essentially only have one kind of undersized center in Daniel Gafford, I imagine it'll be very hard for him to even effectively run an offense off the bench. And Poole's going to even have more trouble with that because Poole is just not naturally a playmaker at all. So I imagine this team's offense is just going to be a ton of just tough shot making and tough shot taking. Though I think if they properly use Avdija and Coulibaly, they could actually create somewhat of a semblance of a playmaking wing duo, but I just don't imagine that they'll do that. Avdija is definitely in need of a change of scenery after being essentially completely misused and miscast for the last few years as essentially a spot-up guy when he really should be a connector. He really should be slashing and cutting and screening and playmaking, not like standing on the wings shooting threes and just not being initiated, not being a part of like a constructive offense whatsoever. And again, their center depth is just awful. So this team's offense, I think, will be at best somewhere in the low 20s. Maybe they can get into the teens. I think if they get to like 15, that's like fantastic, but I don't imagine they'll get that high. And then if we go to the defensive side of the ball, it is awful. Their rookie Bilal Coulibaly is actually an interesting defensive prospect. He's got great length, athleticism, and pretty good defensive instincts, though he is still a teenager. And if Washington can kind of unlock those things, if he sort of shows upside on that side of the ball, then he could actually enhance their defense quite a bit. Though I imagine his complete lack of offensive polish is going to prevent him from cracking the starting lineup for most of the year. And then the only other good defender on this team, I would say, other than, Daniel Gafford, who's probably just like an average defensive center, is Denny Avdia, who's probably one of the more underrated defenders in the NBA, though he alone cannot carry this otherwise dreadful team defense. Jordan Poole and Kyle Kuzma are both pretty bad defenders most of the time, and their other small guards as well as their young wings are not going to be enhancing this defense whatsoever. So big teams are going to destroy them, and small teams are probably also going to have a good time are probably also going to have a pretty good time against them. So I just imagine this team with essentially no center depth. Mike Muscala is their backup. Mike Muscala is old as dirt and not a good defender, and with poor defense in the backcourt is going to get hardcore punished by a majority of the teams in both conferences. So to summarize, this team has very little chemistry and very little continuity. Half of this roster is completely new. This team's offense is essentially predicated entirely around two shot chuckers who are poor playmakers and then also bad defenders. And this team's defense is essentially completely awful outside of two high upside wings. So I would be very surprised if they are no better than a bottom 5 defense, because they just have no defensive personnel. Now, you can get more out of a defense like this with a good coach who sort of galvanizes and rallies the troops on that end. But Wes Unseld Jr. hasn't really proven that he can do that to any degree. So I'm just not really confident at all that they'll be able to cobble together even a competent defense. So yeah, the Wizards are going to suck this year. They're going to be, in my opinion, the worst team in the NBA. And I think they kind of edge out teams like the Spurs and the Blazers just because their high-end talent is kind of redundant. They just have a lot of they just have 2 elite scorers. Well, I shouldn't say elite. Neither of them are that amazing, but like elite in like the role player kind of way. And then they just have a lot of young guys who have essentially no experience in real NBA games. So I imagine this team's really going to stink. And I think my win prediction for them is probably going to be about 23 wins. I think that's probably what gets you the worst record in the NBA this year. The league is really loaded with talent right now. This Wizards team would probably not be the worst in the league, 4 or 5 years ago. But, with just all these holes, I can't imagine that they are any higher than like the 14 seed if they get lucky. I think Poole and Kuz alone should probably be enough to keep them out of like completely like NBA purgatory and like the 15 win range, but I don't imagine they're going to crack 25 wins. So I think 23 is about the mark, and I guess that's it. That's my 10 minutes on the Washington Wizards. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. You guys know what to do. It really means a lot to me, anyone who watches all the way through. And yeah, I'll catch you in the next one.